and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, welcome back. We are doing another one of our influencers episodes. And we always do this where we try to make out that people don't know who the episode is about. But generally, if they've downloaded the podcast, they know what it is. But let's carry on with the charade anyway, because it makes it much more fun. Question for you, Gareth.
Yes.
In 1970,
Yeah.
if you were a woman who was unmarried, could you get a bank loan?
So I think
You were not expecting that as a question.
No, I wasn't. Given the context of the question and the way you're looking at me, I think the answer you're expecting is no.
And that is a correct answer.
Really?
In a working woman with her own income could be denied a bank loan on the grounds that she was unmarried. And I use that as an introduction to our Ruth Bader Ginsburg influencers. And I've almost I think the phrase is cheese sandwiched myself by talking about the degree of influence she had. And the reason why I started there, and we'll do a few more of these, I think, a little bit later on because it's important, is the whole purpose of these episodes are to find the people that we think have had a significant impact on our lives. And as I went through and we looked a little bit at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I realized, number one, I didn't know very much about her. Number two, I probably still don't know that much about her because actually I think she was relatively, I don't want to say private, but I'm going to say quiet. I don't know if you know what I mean, which is she wasn't someone who went out and did a huge amount of press and said, look who I am.
Yeah.
But in terms of her influence, both back actually before the year 2000, but since then has actually been quite significant. So just to rewind back, what do you know about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Gareth?
I know she was a very long time serving member of the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And therefore she was a judge, presumably with a long legal history. I know broadly that she did a lot for women's rights and freedoms, particularly in the US legal system. And I think your question has sort of reaffirmed that. I know she died 5 years ago-ish.
Yeah.
And apart from that, I don't think I know anything about her.
So in a minute, I'll give you sort of her very, very quick high-level summary. This one, I know that we do this occasionally where different episodes, we sort of have different focuses. This is going to be much less about the things that shaped her. There'll be a little bit of that and sort of the history. Unlike some of her other influences, she hasn't escaped from a prisoner of war camp by a rope and then led a Panzer army across the Meuse at various times. But actually, I do want to go back to some of the changes and I think maybe as a vehicle to talk about some of those changes and their influence. So some of the law cases we'll talk about as well. This, I think, is a really good reminder, and I think I'm showing again my liberal bias here, which is I think we talk a lot about rights and we talk a lot about whether positive discrimination and things like that are good or bad. This is a really good opportunity as well to go back and say, well, let's just talk about where we were not very many years ago and remind you why this actually has become something that people feel it's worth fighting for. And I think that as an example, which and it was interesting as we talked about the fact that there was a point in the 1960s, let's say, where you could be as a woman in America, and I presume in the United Kingdom, I don't know if it was different, but refused a loan because you were unmarried. That's a pretty stark statement that you would expect more perhaps of the Taliban at the moment in Afghanistan as opposed to the United States of America. So really, really interesting.
I think it is really interesting how much we make progressive steps forward and then very, very quickly these become normalized and we forget what things were like and we forget the hard work that went into getting these changes through. I was having a conversation with somebody not that long ago about legal changes that politicians talk about, that society convulses against because it's a radical change to the norms, that after the fact become common sense. So the classic example of that is seatbelts in cars. You know, when they tried to introduce seatbelts, and this isn't just in the United Kingdom, this is a repeated pattern around the world. People saw it as an infringement on their rights. You know, this is government overreach. It's a nanny state. With the benefit of hindsight, it's just common sense that you would enforce a law that saves so many lives, and nobody has an issue with seatbelts. And we've normalised it. But I think my point here is that we kind of assume that everything was fine in the past, and that gives us a particular perspective when we look at people, you know, advocating for rights now, and it's very easy to then say, "Oh, it's all fine," and you're just being a bit, you know, fringe or a bit nutty, or you're advocating for this minority group that no one really worries about too much, and you're really, you know, you're a one-trick pony, and I don't want to get into those discussions right now, but I think it's worth recognising that we need people to push boundaries. We need people to highlight these discrepancies and the things that make life seemingly unfair for minority groups.
So there is a risk we'll diverge off sort of the influencer, but I'm not going to let us sort of walk past that. So this week there were the first results. I presume it's a year since they come in for the 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in Wales.
Yeah.
And it was revealed, and I apologize, this was data I saw on the BBC, so I can't give you the specifics, but the implication was it has decreased accidents by 20 to 30%, and therefore a significant number of lives were saved.
Yeah.
And there is a perfect example. You say, well, of course, back in the 60s, people were in the Stone Ages, and so of course they had to change. But today, by the way, the whole 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, which has been an infringement, nanny state, you can't do this. I think it was called a war on the motorist. Actually, I think it's a really good example of exactly that pattern happening again. So we should be under no illusion this pattern is a repeating pattern. And now all of a sudden, forget that it's a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Now imagine in your business or in your organization, you have introduced a new process. And people say, I don't think that's very useful. It worked just fine the way we were doing it before. And so these parallels are about convincing people of the value of change in the face of psychological reasons why people are uncomfortable with change, or there are reasons why people have an objective which is best achieved if they don't allow change to happen.
Yeah.
And so while we're talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, maybe that's a really good context and background that says her changing these rules back then is directly relevant to you today, saying, why are we doing this in the British military? Why do we consider this is the way that we should do things? And here's a last one, and maybe we'll leave this one to later. I think there is a really interesting question around the arc of change. So let's use the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit as an example. And I'm sure there'll be some people screaming about how terrible they are and others saying how brilliant they are. So we start with the idea we should have 20-mile-an-hour speed limits because the science tells us if people drive at 20 miles an hour, it significantly decreases injuries and deaths. Lots of people saying we don't want to do it. Lots of people saying we don't want to do it. And then someone puts the law in. We've seen how that goes. And so if you think about it, you go from no chance of change to the change at the top of the arc. Okay, now there's a really interesting question. Well, logically, if I now reduce the speed limit down to 10 miles an hour, that would reduce deaths even further. In fact, if I want to continue down that road, if we made the speed limit 0, no one would die. We should do that, right? Okay, that's clearly ridiculous, but there's a really interesting question, and I'm trying to make this non-case specific, which is at what point does change cease to be being valuable?
Yes.
And that's, I think, very, very hard because there are almost once the change happens, you want to keep going down that road more. And if we think about the kind of things Ruth Bader Ginsburg thinking about, is like the idea that you would slow down changes to bring positive justice to a group of people seems ridiculous. But as we have talked about on a number of occasions, and we had some really good episodes around DEI, saying, is there a point when DEI goes too far and becomes ridiculous? So maybe there's a conversation about this later, but there's a point where I would argue the assumption that the rate of change stays the same and continues to an ultimately logical destination, that's worth a conversation. Whereas today, I think there'll be many people saying, well, why aren't we lowering the speed limit across the country? And never mind the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. What about the 70-mile-an-hour? Because I can show you similar numbers saying we'd say, well, at what point should you continue it versus not?
And I think that's a really good example, because it's something that when you take it in isolation, it's very easy to argue. As soon as you say, but of course, the counter to that is how many lives are saved and how much has the economy grown by the efficiency of the traffic system. And I've introduced the word system there, and this is complexity. So this is why laws and politics, and we did a whole episode on politics, power, and the relationship of those things to strategy. This is why it becomes so difficult, because you've got people who are advocates of particular subjects. They are, single advocates for a particular thing. And then there are people who are advocating for a different thing. And then there are people who have a more holistic view. And then there are people who judge by sort of a general feeling about the infringement of rights or safety or whatever it is. Yeah, these things are really complex. And I think quite often we use that complexity as an excuse to not tackle difficult issues, and that makes change hard. Sometimes we take a particular decision and we run with it as if it's common sense, and the media grips hold of that common sense, and it becomes the zeitgeist, and it becomes the common sense people against the bureaucracy. And actually, as soon as you get into the complex detail of it, you realise that it's not common sense. It's not a black and white issue. This is nuanced and difficult. I think we've kind of strayed off.
No, it was, but I almost wonder whether maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg might have been quite pleased with this conversation, because it is about complexity, curiosity, and understanding. So let's go back. But maybe I wonder whether we'll stray into this a little bit later on. By the way, I know that my wife does listen to this, possibly out of sympathy more than anything else. And I want to make it very clear, what I'm not suggesting is that women's rights have gone far enough and we don't have to worry about it now, before there is any confusion on that matter. It's just that I think the 70-mile-an-hour speed limit at the moment seems totally fine. There's my balance thesis. Anyway, let's go back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So sort of a big summary for her. Second woman to serve ever on the Supreme Court. Unsurprising given the fact I gave about the ability to have a loan being unmarried. As you've heard us sort of talk a little bit about, a champion of race and gender equality, a pioneering lawyer in terms of enacting law on women's equality, and a civil rights hero. She has become, quite rightly, a feminist symbol. But lesser known, and this is sort of part of her quiet life, is an opera lover. She loved opera. And I think we'll go back and talk about this later, was the subject of an opera.
Really?
Of course.
Okay.
Because that's my favorite thing. And I think this was almost when we said, who should we do next? She was a major pop and culture icon. And so this was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she gained the sort of, weird, but the sobriquet of the notorious RBG, which for those of us who are of a certain age is a play on a rapper's name, a famous rapper. Can I just say I made myself sound really, really old by saying, anyway. key justice on the Supreme Court from 93 to 2020. You're right. She was on it for 27 years. And she was described by Susan Farbstein, who's professor of law at Harvard Law School. So lots of people, obviously, I talked about her, described her in 3 words, which I really liked: fearless, brilliant, resilient. And I think there's some, we do these episodes and we think, oh, we should do an episode around resilience, or I think we've done resilience, fearlessness, but I love that. And lastly, but not least, and I shared this with Gareth just before we started, and the best thing you can do when you do a podcast with someone is leave them with a curious look on their face of, what are you talking about? We will learn why women in the United States can join the military because of Sweden.
Okay. I am still somewhat confused by that.
I know. Well,
Yeah.
so you have to build the narrative tension before you reveal it. Before we now go to her life and talk about sort of where she joined, I think it's really important to go back and talk about some women's rights, both then and now.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start with employment. And so we're talking about 1960s. Assume this is the 1960s, but frankly, this has actually been up to the 1960s. So that's a long time. Jobs obviously heavily gendered. And frankly, women were expected to become secretaries, nurses, teachers, or homemakers. Those were the roles that you were expected as a woman to do. And don't get me wrong, as we have done with many of our influencers, there are women who broke that mold and who tried to break the mold. But let's be really clear, that is what the assumption was. Employers could legally refuse to hire women if they were married or had children. Did you know that?
No,
I don't like the idea of that. You've got children. Sorry, I'm not going to hire you. And maternity leave didn't exist.
Yeah.
Why would we give you time off? And pregnancy was seen as a disqualifier for hiring. I'm going to use the Taliban reference again. If we have any Taliban listeners, well, perhaps you should look very carefully at yourself about why you support the Taliban and its rules, and listen to Battling with Business. But I think you could very easily talk about some of these things that were true and considered inviolate in the 1960s. And now we look at them and say, well, that's the sort of thing the Taliban would do.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think there's an interesting conversation around the term feminism, because I think where a lot of these divisive subjects and quite often progressive campaigning, progressive development of society and legal frameworks becomes very divisive. And feminism is one of those things. And I was having a conversation with somebody a few years ago, and I was sort of talking around this, and I've always sort of seen myself as quite a progressive liberal. I think that we should be inclusive. I think people generally are good and are forced into situations where they make bad choices, or I think there is an inherent sort of power struggle, and there is something about human nature that means we're not all perfect. But generally, collective thinking, collective group organisation is better than working in small stovepipes. And so I suppose naturally I see myself as an advocate of women's rights, minority rights, and I was talking about the fact that I thought the term feminism was potentially being used as a weapon against those rights, in that there are extreme versions, like all political movements, there are extreme versions. And the person I was talking to was basically saying, well, I think feminism is a very simple thing. It's basically the acceptance that you believe that women should play an equal part in society, and in which case we are all feminists, or most of us are feminists. I think the challenge is that there are nuances to the word feminism, and there certainly were. I think it's less the case these days, but there were certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s very, very extreme elements of feminist movement, to the point where they were almost anti-men. And I think we've seen the same things with some of the other progressive movements where fringe elements take it to the extreme, and that becomes the thing that everybody focuses on, or the other side focuses on.
100%. This is the, well, look, this we hold this up as the representation of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And if you look at this, I think we would all agree this is ridiculous. I completely agree with you. But there's a more subtle thing, which I think before you even get there, and thank you, Ruth, for enabling us to have these conversations. For you to change a thing, you have to name a thing.
Yeah.
So you might choose feminism, but you might choose young men in a particular part of the country have less access to education. Whatever the thing that you wish to change and advance, you have to name. The moment you name something, you start to extract it from the group.
Yeah.
And so that's a really nuanced point, which is, well, of course you've got to name it. And what do you mean? The problem is the moment you say the word feminism, you're starting to provide an opportunity for someone to say, I thought your definition of that we are all equal and feminism is a way of identifying a group, they're equal as well. But by naming something like feminism or indeed anything else, it's easy for people to say, well, I'm going to now take that and I'm going to find value in making it more separate than others.
Yeah.
So there's this really interesting thing. And I think I get very excited wherever I work and whenever I work about how we name things. And I don't know people who've worked with me. They roll their eyes when I do this, but naming something becomes really, really important. And as you say, I mean, the example we've just given around feminism is probably maybe an extreme and a different example, but think about what you name things, because you might get things you don't expect after you do these things.
Yeah, but again, if you look at the sort of academic discourse around feminism, I think there are about 12 different versions of feminism, including postmodernist feminism. And I don't profess to know what all these things are, but they're all very, very different interpretations. There was about 10 years ago, probably maybe even slightly longer now, a sort of push to normalize feminism again. And I don't know if you remember, but people were in the House of Commons here in the UK wearing T-shirts that said, I am a feminist. And that was I think, trying to recapture the term and bring it back into normal use as the logical, we want to just make the world a fairer place and a better place and get rid of things like not allowing women to have bank loans because they're not.
I love the word recapture the meaning of things, because I think that's really important. It's sort of like there's this little ongoing conflict about, I get to own this word. So the one that we classically hear is, do you love your country? Which is a very dangerous phrase, because for some people it means, yes, I do love my country. I quite like Yorkshire pudding and us not doing very well at the World Cup, and I love all of those things. And for other people it means, if you don't agree with these three things, you are a traitor to your country. So anyway, let's go back. We otherwise we will continue to wonder on this. Turns out this is quite a tricky subject. Finance. Let's go back to the 1960s. I talked about the fact a woman with her own income could be denied a bank loan. You could not get a credit card or a mortgage as a woman without a husband or male co-signer until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. That's
amazing.
It is amazing. And it feels like everyone is like, women's rights. No, these were bloody basic rights. These weren't even giving people an unfair advantage. These were very basic rights, which, how could we not have done these things?
And I bet at the time people felt very progressive, because I suspect in the 1950s it was even worse. And in the 1930s it was even worse.
And I would imagine that there were people who would of great respect and authority that would tell you that they have no problem with rights for women, but this is a step too far because insert reasons. So here you go. Gareth here is getting slightly irked by this. I can see your sort of ire.
Am I?
Well, no, just about that's ridiculous. That's just absolutely ridiculous. Here's another one. We talk about gender discrimination today as a bad thing. In other words, we should not discriminate between genders. The legal system in the United States upheld gender discrimination as natural.
Yeah.
Not just it's acceptable, but it is the natural thing. Laws refer to men as the primary breadwinners and women as dependents. So in many states in the United States, if a man died, his widow would not automatically inherit his estate, whereas men would always inherit from their wives.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is not cool. So before we start to say, oh, women have gone crazy, let's be clear where their rights came from.
Yeah.
And frankly, if I was a woman, I'd be pretty bloody angry with the men who said this was not only okay, but probably worked hard to defend it. And lastly, some colleges and professional schools actually capped the number of female students. I think we've got enough women here. Let's not have any more. Women were often not allowed into Ivy League or medical schools until the late 1960s. And in fact, there are a set of Ivy League schools which are, in a sense, parallel. And I was told the name of them last weekend and I've forgotten, but there were schools for women because the men's schools wouldn't take them.
Yeah.
So when Ruth Bader Ginsburg entered Harvard Law School in 1956, she was only one of 9 women in a class of 500, and we'll come back to that a bit later.
Amazing.
So the point there is, this was really a long run up of nearly half an hour to say she was a huge proponent. Today, if you went to Americans and said, when did these things happen, they would have assumed in the 1900s or 1800s, when in fact this was the 1970s. So huge change.
Yeah, and it's worth recognising that, yeah, my service in the Royal Marines classed as a combat arm of the military. Yeah, during my regular service, there was no females in the Royal Marines.
Well, but that's fine though. I mean, look, there's rights for women, but I mean, the idea that they would have the equal ability to go and fight for their country and die for their country, I think that one's, oh, wait a minute, that one's ridiculous
Yeah.
as well. And anyone who's now angry and saying, they can't run, they can't carry people or whatever, please go to the Ukraine and Israel where they have women in the forces. And I don't hear many people going, oh, we're stopping that because that's terrible.
Yeah, and it's, again, it's this incremental creep and change that allows us to think that we are in the right moment now and we should stop. Yes, it makes sense to make those changes before, but there is a point where it's too far. And it's really interesting because I was having conversations as I left the Royal Marines. We were just starting to talk about women on the front line and whether women should be in combat roles. And interestingly, we've just gone through a change in the British Army and now the Royal Marines where we're allowed to wear beards. We're allowed to grow a beard. And
Step too far, Gareth.
I'm talking to friends that are still serving, and again, it's, yeah, really, because it's a change,
Divisive as well.
divisive, and I think that says something about our psychology. But I just wanted to make the point that we still have work to do in getting people to recognise the equality of gender, and I use the word gender, not sex, very deliberately, in other parts of society. And the military, I think, is perhaps, and maybe understandably so, and we can have that discussion perhaps on another episode, the slowest of the institutions to have adapted.
Is there a different, because I think people fundamentally are, and I'm going to use this word badly, afraid of change. Let me put it a different way. I think people want to cling on tightly to things they know to be true and they participated in. And so I hear this and it frustrates me. Oh, we should go back to the glory days of the 1950s. No, we shouldn't.
Yeah.
Lots of terrible things happened in the 1950s. And I personally don't want to die of polio. Thank you very much. But the point there is we do have this as human beings, this very natural sense of holding on to the things we know and understand and we had made sense of, because we need a framework for reference. And when things change around us, that's really uncomfortable. But here's another way of thinking about it. And it's funny, this is much more relevant to people's day-to-day work than I had imagined when I sort of wrote some of these notes, which is, think of this a different way. This is not about that there is some nirvana of rights or process or way to do things, and that somehow we're slowly edging towards that place. And then when we get there, we go, woohoo, we have all the rights or we have the perfect process. Actually, what we're saying is the world evolves and changes and grows. And all of these things mean what we did last year probably may or probably doesn't make sense in 10 years' time. The things that we believe to be true, we have all moved on. And we were just talking about the visit we did to Cranwell. I don't know whether that will have gone out or not gone out. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that they talked about the leadership team at Cranwell was the RAF is changing. The people in the RAF are changing because the country is changing. And the example they gave was and I'm going to use the phrase, the older generation in the military, when they are asked, how would you like to entertain the troops? How do you want to give them a good life? Would say, oh, we need a really lovely bar because we like drinking. And the younger generation say, no, we want a coffee shop, please. Or we want a gaming room. That's not bad. And I'm sure that people going, but when we used to drink, no. It's just a reflection. These things change. Okay, I'm going to drag us back. In fact, I tell you what, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to pretend that we've talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg for the last half an hour. And when we come back, we're going to trot through her life. And we're going to talk a bit more about some of the changes that she brought, because I think it's really important.
Cool.
Welcome back. Well, welcome back to probably one of the least successful influencers we've done so far, because we've only talked about her for 30 seconds, I think. Please forgive us, audience. Hopefully you find the conversation more broadly interesting. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have actually been pleased, because this is what she fought for. Let's go back. She was born in 1933 in Brooklyn. She was born, I love this, Joan Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The Ginsburg, I think, comes later. But anyway, she changed to Ruth in kindergarten because there were too many Jones.
Right.
That's fantastic. I once worked with someone and his name was John. And about 2 years later, when we got to know each other quite well, he angrily reported to me, by the way, why do we get to call you Chris? And I said, well, it's my name. And he looked at me and said, no, but it's my name as well. I said, no, your name's John. And he said, no,
You're a bit confused.
my name is Chris, but I was told there are too many Chris's, and so I had to be called John. And then you came to the company and you were called. So anyway, there we go. There you go. That's why Ruth Bader Ginsburg is Ruth Bader Ginsburg rather than Joan Bader Ginsburg. She was the youngest of two children of Nathan Bader, a merchant, and Celia Bader. Their parents, or the father at least, was a Jewish immigrant from Odessa in the Ukraine, and mother's family came from Krakow. I've got a real problem saying Krakow at the moment, because I want to say Krakow or Krakow. I think it's Krakow. By the way, this is the liberal episode, I think. Oh, look, it turns out that immigration can be a good thing. Bringing those people helped create one of the greatest Supreme Court members that we know. She was not allowed to have a bar mitzvah because, and I'm not a religious expert, Orthodox restrictions say that women can't read from the Torah. She was quite disappointed about that. Hang on a minute, why can you do it but I can't do it? I think is safe to say. She had some family tragedies. Her elder sister Marilyn died of meningitis, and I think her mother was diagnosed with cancer and died just before Ruth's graduation from school. So there was some death in the family. I always wonder what kind of an impact that has on people. I don't know, but something to think about. She entered Cornell University on a full scholarship. Ruth was a smart young lady. And then Ruth married Martin, her husband, in 1954, 9 days after she graduated from Cornell. And I bring up, it's interesting, we've talked about husbands for many of our female influencers, because I think they really do have quite a big impact. If the husbands aren't supportive, that's going to make it a lot harder.
But we don't talk about the wives of the men that we talk about. That's interesting.
Isn't that
And
interesting?
is that a reflection of the society within which those people were in at the time, and the fact that men had more influence over their wives because of the societal injustices? Or is that a reflection of our biases?
I think it's a reflection of our biases, and I suspect in
Mm.
20 years, when we hand over this podcast to our kids, which should terrify them, the idea they'll look back and say, why is it that the influencer men have never spoken about their wives? They will look poorly upon us and say, why would that be the case? So yes, let's awkwardly move on from
Well,
that one.
I think we should just aim to do better.
We should. And thank you, Mrs. Kitchener and Mrs. Tennant, for supporting us doing some of these silly things. Ruth's husband drafted into the US Army for the Korean War. And at that point, the Ginsburgs spent 2 years in Oklahoma, where he was stationed. So the point I'm making is Ruth has had children.
Yeah.
She is balancing being a mother, but also she's beginning her studies at Harvard Law School. She then goes on from Cornell to Harvard Law School.
And I think it's probably, dragging this tentatively to the military sort of parts of the story, because that's my role. It's worth recognising how difficult it is to be the spouse of an active serving military person, whether they're male or female, but in this case, being the wife. Yeah, so doing that whilst also being a mother, whilst also having a full-time job, is incredibly difficult. And even to this day, it's very, very difficult, whether you are the husband or the wife supporting the family, because military service by its nature makes co-parenting very, very difficult, because you are away a lot. It's very difficult to set clear routines, and so dependency on parenting falls to the spouse. It's worth noting that, I think.
I think it is. And actually, there's an interesting question, which is, does that spur some people to go the extra mile? In adversity, do people dig in further and say, well, I believe in this even more, and so almost there's more?
I think for the right people, the people that have that kind of tenacity and determination, I think for a lot of people it is a limiting factor on them reaching and achieving their own potential. I think not necessarily part of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg story, but worth recognising that it is a sacrifice that the families of serving military personnel make, and it's a sacrifice that isn't necessarily recognised enough. And I really like the fact, I do quite a lot of work with the Canadians these days, and I really like the fact that in Canada, when a service person leaves the military, very much like in the UK or in the US, there is a celebration of their service, and the longer you've served, the more elaborate that is. But it is the spouse that receives a medal, and they receive a medal for being a supportive family of that service person for the duration of their career. And I really like that. And I think that's something we should think about more and celebrate more. Anyway.
I feel now really guilty, because I can imagine that spouse to say, I've done all this bloody work and you've given me a medal. What am I supposed to do with that? But that's a different thing. Anyway, 1956. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is at Harvard. She's only, as we mentioned before, one of 9 women amongst 500 men. And she is even more unusual because of those 9 women, she's the only one that is married and the only one that has a child.
Yeah.
And we'll hear this later on, the only one that I don't know this is true, but probably the only one that was Jewish as well. So the odds are stacking up against her. And just to give you a sense, I mean, I think we've painted this picture quite well, but this one got me so much I had to write it down. There was at Harvard, there was something called the Radcliffe Cooking Contest. Oh, that seems reasonable. Cooking contest. Sure. One male student and his roommates decided that they would have a competition, and they would have a different girl come and cook for them. And at the end of the year, they would give a prize to the winner of the Radcliffe Cooking Contest. And then the law school decided that's a jolly good idea, getting these girls to come and cook for us. And instead of inviting women from the whole of the school, they decided the women from the class would be invited. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her female colleagues were invited to come and, I think the phrase is, perform for the men and cook for them. That is where Gareth's got another look on his face of like, this is not great. This is not great. And let's go one step further. But luckily, the dean of Harvard Law School, Erwin Griswold, he's going to put a stop to this, right? Actually, I'm being really, really unfair. We'll come back to this a second. Actually, he does. This ruins my story, but he does. But he invited all the female law students to a dinner at his family home and asked the female law students, including Ginsburg, why are you at Harvard Law School taking the place of a man?
Wow.
Now, I want to be very, very clear because I did a little bit of research here, and actually it turns out that he participated in some lawmaking with Ruth later on. Actually, out of context, that sounds like a terrible phrase. And I think actually it represents what many men perceived. Actually, it turns out for Griswold, it was the opposite reason. He was effectively saying, you are going to be asked through your careers why you have taken the place of a man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you that question because you need to understand and be clear on what the answer is when you talk to them. So when I first read that, I was furious. You're apparently in charge. Actually, it turns out, I believe he asked it for a different reason. And this was, they asked his family later on about this, so they got a bit more information.
Is there a sense of while she's at college and these things are happening that she is already starting to push back, or does that come later?
I think this is the beginning of that pushback. I mean, look, it's clearly a continuum of people saying this isn't fair, and then the first people getting the ability to start to change it. But I think this really is, she was such a fundamental part of this change that she actually changed many of these laws. By the way, just going back to my point about Griswold, in 93, he argued a case in front of the Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And he continued to be really supportive of her, comparing the work that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had done for women's rights to that which Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall had done for civil rights of racial minorities. So he was comparing her to some of the absolute historical greats of this law. She also served on the editorial staff of the Harvard Law Review, which she was the first woman to do so, unsurprisingly. And when her husband, who had left the military, graduated and accepted a job with a law firm in New York City, she actually requested to complete her third year at Columbia Law School. And she was allowed to do that, and then she served on the law review for Columbia, the first person to do both. And then she graduated tying in first place in her class in 1959. So just to get to where she's got to through the military service, the family, the views, the moving colleges, and then finishing in first in 1959, that is, of course, impressive on its own. However, there's always a however these things. So you would think she is just first in her place at Columbia Law School, finding a job, easy. Nope. Quote, not a law firm in the entire city of New York would employ me, she said later. I struck out on 3 grounds. I was Jewish, a woman, and a mother. Right. I'm glad that legally you'd get in a lot of trouble for saying that today. At the time, only a very small percentage of lawyers were women, and only 2 women had ever served as federal judges. One of her Columbia law professors advocated on her behalf and helped convince another judge on the US District Court to offer her a clerkship. So that's sort of the first job. And quote, this law professor threatening to never recommend another Columbia student to the judge if he did not give Ginsburg the opportunity, and guaranteeing to provide the judge with a replacement clerk should Ginsburg not succeed. Going to your point about behind men, we don't talk about the women as much as we don't talk about the women behind the men. I think we often don't talk about the people who give these people a hand up.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a judge who threatened another judge, a very strong and not legally binding word, but that throughout history there were these facilitators who just helped to happen. If we think back to Amelia Earhart, there were some people who gave her an aeroplane and said, this is for you to go demonstrate what women can do. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think, part of the discussion around any minority group being treated fairly is the people in the majority group advocating on their behalf. And of course, the story is not quite as glamorous if you talk about a man who advocates for women's rights than a really successful woman that breaks barriers. But it is important to recognise that there were other people in this fight, and that you know, even to this day, we all have a part to play in having the discussion, in understanding the complexities, understanding the nuance, understanding where is too far, where is not far enough, but also recognizing that it's not for the people in minority groups to have to fight their corner. It's for everybody to fight the collective assumptions and biases.
Well, what I like about this is it's this, and again, I'm going to tie this back to any change that you want to bring in an organization. It's building a coalition of the willing.
Yeah.
There's I see people who say, I want this change to happen. I'm the only one, but I'm just going to bludgeon my way through and convince people with truth and justice, and I will get through.
Yeah.
And not only does that not always happen, as in often they will fail. But the second thing is it becomes a bit weird because it's all about you, not about the cause.
Yeah.
This is a good example of coalition of the willing. And I was talking this week at work today about some changes that we want to bring, which are both procedural but also cultural, and the critical importance of us having that coalition of the willing. It's not just about one group or one person saying, I think we should change. It's about a group of people, as you say, discussing why do we want to do this? And you know what? We are aligned. So I think that's important. I talked about Sweden, and you'll start to see the influence that variety and diversity has on people. So from 61 to 63, Ginsburg was a research associate at Columbia Law School on international procedure. And to do that, the first thing she did was a book on civil procedure in Sweden. Oh my, I bet that was a thrilling book. But never mind about the boringness of civil procedure in Sweden. She did lots of research. She went to Lund University in Sweden, and she was really influenced by their thinking and where Sweden was at that point, particularly on things like gender equality. And she saw changes happening in Sweden, where we just talked about the fact she was one of 9 in a class of 500. In Sweden, 20 to 25% of all law students were women. So she could see what that change was, and she took it back. So she's now hired by the Rutgers School of Law as an assistant professor. So she's now building her seniority, and so presumably at this point people are judging her on merit and what she has achieved, and certainly not asked by the dean of the school to accept a lower salary because her husband has a well-paying job. There you go. She was at this point one of only 20 female law professors in the United States. It's hard. She becomes pregnant and has a second child in 1965, and, quote, she wore oversized clothes for fear that her contract would not be renewed. Because, okay. 1972, she co-founds the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, and in 1973 she becomes the project's general counsel. Now she's starting to get her hands on the levers of what you might call power to be able to change. And as the Women's Rights Project and the ACLU projects, they participated in more than 300 gender discrimination cases by 1974. And what that really means is to change the law, and this was very much Ruth thinking, you would litigate individual cases. You would look for individual cases that were clearly unfair, and you could talk about. And that was very much, rather than asking the court to end all this gender discrimination, she charted a very strategic course. And when I wrote these notes, I put the word Ginsburg charted a strategic course in bold and italics, because we talk about this often, about are our influences tactical or strategic? This to me seems like a very, very carefully thought out strategy. We are going to litigate 300 cases, and in doing so, the strategic outcome is to change the broader set of laws around that to create the change.
And it's probably worth, I'm not a legal expert, but it's probably worth just explaining that case law is about setting precedents and building based off previous judgments around similar cases, a precedent that can be taken forward and applied in future cases. Whereas there are sweeping laws that can be enacted that apply, across the board. But most of the US, I believe, legal framework is based off case law, as it is in the United Kingdom.
Yep.
So there are, underlying sort of laws that are just accepted. Then there is case law that explores the sort of complex and nuanced bits of those things. And then there are legal acts of parliament that are sweeping laws that apply, they are black and white and apply across, the whole of society. So recognizing that you probably aren't going to be able to, have an act of Congress that is going to suddenly create equality across a whole field of employment law isn't going to work. Yeah, I think it's an obvious example of strategic thought and a
brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in this case, which is if you say we should treat women equally as this example, but of course for anything else, it's very easy for people to argue, well, of course that's not true. And let me give you cases. The case law was explicit cases where you're saying, well, in this very real case, what you think is right. And so you're building 300 reasons why this is actually the right thing to do. But let's go back. You gave earlier a definition of feminism, which I thought was very good. What was your definition of feminism?
I think the advocacy of equality of women in society, something like that.
Sorry, you've got the look of I panicked you. Yeah. The reason why I said that was,
really clear, that is not my definition.
No, but
a way of viewing feminism.
The way, and remembering back a whole 50 minutes ago, remembering the way you described it was, you were describing feminism as equality as anyone else would be. So it's no different. There's nothing special about women's equality versus men's equality.
I think there is a nuance to that though, which is the common sense. And I use the word common sense in inverted commas because it might not be that common, but recognizing that there are things that are different about men and women. That's true. And so it's making accommodations for those differences. So menstrual cycles, pregnancy.
Indeed.
These are things that only affect one half of society. And we should absolutely recognize that this is not saying men and women are exactly the same and therefore should be treated exactly the same. It's men and women should be given the same opportunities.
I feel bad for having put you into that corner.
Well, I think it's an important discussion though, because if you don't say those things, then what happens is those get used as counter arguments.
I agree.
Say, well, you're saying they're all the same, but they're not the same. They take 9 months off to go and have a baby, and yes, they do. And we should
talk about
that, and we should talk about what we think as a society is fair. And actually, a bit like your 20-mile-an-hour speed limit thing, the data very, very clearly shows that if you accommodate for that, it is better for the employee and the employer.
Well, this was
the long term.
This was why I brought that up again. Was that when Ginsburg was conducting these cases, she chose plaintiffs very carefully. She was at time picking male plaintiffs to demonstrate that gender discrimination was harmful to both men and women. In other words, this was a gender discrimination question as opposed to women discrimination against women.
Yeah.
We're now at the point in 1993, Bill Clinton nominates her as an associate judge on the Supreme Court. And she was viewed at that time as a moderate and a consensus builder, which is not unusual given where she's come from and her liberal views. She's the second female and first Jewish female justice of the Supreme Court. We talked about this at the very beginning. There was a little bit of controversy towards the end of her career. I say towards, obviously she carried on till 2020. People wanted her to retire so another liberal justice could be chosen. So in the United States, you are a justice in the Supreme Court for life.
Yeah.
Unless you retire. And so obviously there is a concern that you want young and healthy people, as it happened when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. All of a sudden it goes back to Congress to decide. And so this is how they decide the balance of the court potentially.
And that's an interesting thing, because I think the United States is the only country that has an elected bench. So for the Supreme Court and for other courts, but not all, you are elected to the bench. And that's an anathema when you consider that the judiciary is supposed to be a balance against the lawmakers in Congress and the executive. We talked about that before.
There's a much longer conversation.
It's become a very politicized thing, and it becomes ever more politicized. But the reason it's important now is Mexico is about to enact a law that means that all judges in Mexico across the board are going to be elected officials. That's a really dangerous thing, because what you're effectively doing there is making the role of the judiciary a popular elected thing, and therefore the will of the people, which is so important in democracy, becomes part of your legal system. So people will make judgments of law based on what they think society wants, not what is right. And the whole balance of legal judgment is about what is right. It also means, particularly in Mexico, that organized criminal gangs will probably put people up for election. And Mexico doesn't have the best history of free and fair elections. It also means that there is an awful lot of politicization, or will be an awful lot of politicization of the legal system. Slight sidebar, but it's something that I feel quite strongly about.
Well, it's almost as if you should separate the law from politics.
Absolutely.
But here you go. Here's the law and politics coming together. So Obama met with her in 2013, pointing out the Democrats could soon lose control of the Senate, and nudged her towards stepping down. The point being, if she stepped down, they could vote in another liberal Supreme Court appointee, and she refused. Interesting. I don't know enough about that, so it was good or bad.
Well, I would say that that's a really complex discussion, but on the very, very simple face of it, she is probably refusing to be part of that
political process. Well, the suggestion, lawyer and author Linda Hirschman believed that in the lead up to the 2016 election, Ginsburg was waiting hilariously for Hillary Clinton to beat Donald Trump. I believe that didn't happen, before she would retire. So interesting. Here's some important, so that really is sort of her career, but I think more importantly that when things happen and where she was in place, we can talk about just a couple of her legal cases, because again, I think this starts to bring to life these ideas of what was it that would change. In 1972, Moritz versus Commissioner. Charles Moritz was denied a tax deduction for caring for his elderly mother because the law only allowed, quote, women or formerly married men to take that deduction. Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued it was unconstitutional to assume that only women are caregivers. What an excellent example of equality. And this was her first big victory in 1972. 1971. And
before you move on to the next one, I think we've talked about it already, but it's worth just highlighting that she's picked a case there where
it's a man.
The plaintiff is a man.
Yes.
He's arguing that the law is unfair against men in this case. And to go back to your point about her being a strategist, I think that's incredibly powerful and incredibly useful in setting those conditions. It is about case law that is setting conditions to say, hey, actually, maybe the law isn't particularly fair. And a system that is biased towards the views of men will probably have more sympathy in a single case where the plaintiff is a man.
it was interesting as you were saying that. I thought you were going to say shaping the battlefield. But for our military listeners,
absolutely.
she is shaping the battlefield.
Yeah.
1971, Reed versus Reed, an Idaho law said that men must be preferred over women when two parents apply to administer their deceased child's estate. Because obviously, Ruth helped argue the case before the Supreme Court and won, making it the first time the court struck down a law for gender discrimination. And so obviously now you're opening the door. As you said, you've got the case law.
Yeah.
United States versus Virginia. This was a Supreme Court case. The culmination of her campaign for equal treatment in the law, she changed the Virginia Military Institute's practice of excluding qualified women from admission merely because of sex. Quote, generalizations about the way women are no longer justify denying opportunity. And I go back to, I didn't actually say this, when Ruth was in Sweden, she saw women in the Swedish military. And so she said, we should allow women in the military. There's the gender equality. And so this is an example. I think this actually ultimately leads to the ability to have women in the US military.
Yeah.
Last case. Sorry, I know these are sort of very nerdy cases, but really nice little examples, probably each of which make you go, well, that seems reasonable. That seems reasonable. Ledbetter versus Goodyear. She pushed Congress to enact and President Obama to sign the equal pay legislation in 2009. Through the Equal Pay Act, or even though the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, Ruth supported stronger protections, including Ledbetter versus Goodyear, where she dissented about the extent to which you're allowed to have unequal pay. And so there was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009, which gave much clearer guidelines. And I'm trying to remember, I saw a humorous meme on a social media page, which was about women who want to be engineers, CEOs, and something else are being encouraged to take lower paid jobs now, i.e. female engineers, female CEOs. And I thought that was a hilarious representation that even today, women are still paid typically less in most organizations. Let's zoom. So the impact she had on the law, as we have said, is enormous. But the person, she played cello when she was younger. And I love this because whenever I saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was this lovely little old lady that was doing weightlifting. We'll come back to that. But she was a baton twirler. There you go. Right. So there's a don't judge your book by the cover. Another fact that I found, which I thought was interesting, she failed her driving test 5 times. She was a terrible cook. Literally, she was forbidden to cook by her children, which I thought was fantastic. And she was a fitness fanatic. There was Stephen Colbert of a US late night comedian who has his own daily show. There's a video. He goes to see her when she was still alive, and he does the fitness program with her, and she did 20 push-ups a day. There is also a book called the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Workout, which I love. As I mentioned, she loved opera. I'll come back to that. And she often worked until the early hours of the morning. She had to be, given all the things that she was doing.
I think that's quite a common thing, isn't it? Against the influences that we look at, that it's not they're naturally just rising to the top.
No, they work hard at it.
And there is hard work that is above and beyond what is normal, in that they are working very, very long hours and they're making sacrifices to do things. And I think in this case, we've talked about why that's probably the case.
And that is why I will never be truly great, because I'm in bed by 10 o'clock, because God damn it, I want my sleep. Anyway, this I saw, and again, I am allowing myself to be sort of dragged into the world of a political viewpoint, but she had her favorite amendment. And her favorite amendment of the US Constitution.
Don't we all have a favorite amendment?
Well, I don't know. What's your favorite amendment? We'll leave that for a future episode. Her favorite amendment was the 14th, and that was all persons born or naturalized in the US will be granted citizenship. And today, that very amendment is being questioned and argued against.
Yeah.
And people are talking about saying we will reverse that. And I'll just the final political statement, many of these people are constitutionalists who claim that the Constitution should be taken exactly as written and not interpreted, and yet they are precisely doing that. Really, really interesting, for me at least, and this is about, I'm going to use the word team building, it's the wrong answer. We talked about the coalition of the willing, that's when people agree with you, but it's really important to also talk to the people who don't agree with you. And someone who was on the Supreme Court with her was Antonin Scalia. And he was very clearly, well, she was Republican. He was much more on the right. She was a
Democrat.
liberal and more Democrat aligned. He was a Republican and more right wing. And actually, Scalia is not beloved by the left, and they believe he's not. They disagreed strongly with his view, as of course the right strongly disagreed with RBG. He was her closest colleague on the court, and they often dined together and went to opera together because they were both opera lovers. And I love that, because and I believe that was something she was extraordinarily proud of, that even though they had differences of opinion, they could still come together, they could still be friends, and they could still, and I like to think there was a connection, which is, we've talked about this a lot, being curious and being open to change. The way to be open to change is not to surround yourself with the people who all say the same thing, but to surround yourself also with people who have very divergent views.
Well, I think if there's one theme that's coming through this podcast episode, it's the fact that these are complex, nuanced issues. And whilst there is a hindsight bias that tells you there is a right and a wrong, I think the reality is these are not battles of good and evil. These are battles of differences of opinion and differences of viewpoints, and cross-bench discussion and discourse, and not demonizing the other side, is how you create positive change. If there's one thing that we're seeing a decline of, particularly in US politics, I think, but it's a common trait across democracies worldwide, it is the entrenchment and polarization of positions. And that, I think, is a really, really sad reality.
And very dangerous. Just before we finish off on sort of her life, and we'll touch on a bit of popular culture, and I'm going to play my favorite quote game, which I love. We talked about the fact that Scalia was a great friend of hers, and they both enjoyed going to the opera. Someone made an opera which had her and Anthony Scalia as the heroes and the sort of the main protagonist in this opera, and they both went to the opening of this opera, and I love that. I think that is absolutely wonderful.
Amazing.
A person who has had this sort of struggle through her life, I bet that tickled her pink. Sadly, she died from pancreatic cancer in 2020. She was 87 and an active member of the US Supreme Court, and still delivering value and justice in the Supreme Court. So she had a worthy life. In culture, I picked a couple of these out. She had a praying mantis named after her.
Okay.
And the reason why, so she was very famous because she had I think it's called a jabot. It looks like a sort of a large sort of neck plate thing. Go look up Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you will see this. But the praying mantis has a piece of a neck plate, which looks very much like this. So there you go. Quote, the researchers noted the name was a nod to Ginsburg's fight for gender equality. So I think that's quite good. There's a Women's Leadership Award named after her. She actually presented the first award. And then after being presented to women in 21 to 23, which was the principle of this, based on the fact it was the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Women of Leadership Award. After 23, the organization changed its award guidelines, with 4 of the 5 awards going to men, including Elon Musk and Rupert Murdoch. The Ginsburg family distanced itself from the award and asked for her name to be removed from it.
Yeah, that's
can't understand why. I don't know.
Slightly odd.
She's got a ship named after her, and in her quote, her increasingly fiery dissents, particularly in the Shelby County versus Holder case, led to the creation of the sobriquet, the notorious RBG, as you have said, a takeoff from the notorious BIG, which became an internet meme. And she admitted to having a large supply of Notorious RBG t-shirts, which she distributed as gifts. I like the fact she had a bit of sense of humor. She, the last two, which I love, in the Deadpool 2, a photo of her is shown as Deadpool considers her for his X-Force team of superheroes. And lastly, there is a Lego minifigurine of Ginsburg shown within the Lego 2 movie. And Ginsburg gave a blessing for that Lego cameo, as well as to having the minifigurine produced as part of Lego toy sets.
I think if I was going to have an indelible mark on popular culture, I would want a Lego figure of me. I think that is achieving notoriety.
And the reason we do this, where we talk about the impact on culture, but that's really interesting. She's kind of invisible.
Yeah.
Most people don't know the work that she's done, and yet the fact that she did have this impact and these mentions and the way people have thought about her, I think is impressive. Here's last few quotes, and you've heard me say this in previous episodes, which is sometimes it's quite hard to hear the person. And while quotes are taken out of context and very narrow, maybe this gives you a bit more flavor. Here are some of my favorites. And the first one, Gareth will get points when he says who else uses this today. So her first quote was, "You can disagree without being disagreeable." So that's the rest is politics. They use that to agree disagreeably. Next quote, "If you're going to change things, you have to be with the people who hold the levers." It's blindingly obvious, but of course, this is the coalition of the willing, having dinner with Anthony Scalia. You have to be with the people who hold the levers. We talked about feminism and the definition. She had a definition of feminism. Quote, "Feminism. I think the simplest explanation and the one that captures the idea is the song that Mario Thomas sung. Free to be you and free to be me."
There we go.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that.
Next quote, "Reading is the key that opens the doors to many good things in life. Reading shaped my dreams, and more reading helped me make my dreams come true. For all those people like me who are thinly read, Ruth Bader says, go read some more books." This is quite nice, and this almost goes to this particular quote is about power, but also it is about any ideas, I think, taken to an extreme. When contemplated in its extreme, almost any power looks dangerous. Again, as we have talked about today, that is quite right. Fight for things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception. And lastly,
that one just seems like an anachronism now, doesn't it?
But if you have to say that, that tells you.
My point.
And I think that's still. I think there are still changes that need to be made today.
Yeah.
And if people go, no, women's rights have gone too far. Statistically, women are paid less for men than the same jobs. Just take that as a tiny, narrow example. When are we going to change that, and how are we going to change that? The last one, I would like to be remembered as someone who used whatever talent she had to do her work to the very best of her ability and to help her repair tears in her society, to make things a little better through the use of whatever ability she has. And that, I think, is a fantastic way to finish our description of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Trailblazer and law changer, strategist, tenacious, continuing when many of us would have given up, and a real driver of the world we live in today, generous and inclusive.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you for that, Griff. I think, firstly, we've made the point that we all have a part to play in making society a fairer, better place for all. And it shouldn't take heroes from within minority groups. It should take collective effort from all of us to be part of that discourse. But secondly, it's made me stop and think about some of the things that I'm less interested in that actually perhaps other people are very interested in that I can be part of a discussion about. And I think it comes back to some of the core traits and attributes that we talk about regularly, and that's curiosity. And I think if it wasn't for the fact we were doing this podcast, I probably wouldn't be that interested in going and finding out about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But, an hour of discussion, and I'm inspired to think a little bit more about where the current discourse is and where current change is going, and what's right and what's not right, and what we need to discuss to find out more about. I think going right back to the very beginning, your 20 mile an hour speed limit example, and for those that aren't aware, in Wales, that has a independent ability to enact laws for Wales. They have, by law, made all previously 30 mile an hour speed limits 20 miles an hour. A lot of England, and I believe probably Scotland, but I don't know, have locally adopted some of that. So we've got 20 mile an hour speed limits in some places, but that is local councils applying discretion. In Wales, it is a legal statute. When that happened, I was, I think, sceptical, and I was part of the, well, I think things are fine and it'll just slow people down, and isn't this just one group advocating for something without necessarily recognizing? When you see the statistics, I know I was wrong, and I think that's okay. And I think but it is useful and important to recognise that I was wrong, because I will take that forward now, and then next time I'm in a pub arguing for something being silly and nanny state, or it's got
Health and safety gone mad.
Of course, I'm an advocate, but this has gone too far. I will stop and think, actually, do I know enough about this to have a strong voice?
I wonder whether
I need to find out more? Do I need to ask more questions? Do I need to read more?
I wonder whether we did an episode a long time ago, which I really enjoyed doing, because it came from a lot of experience of how do you know when a project isn't going well? Go back and listen to that one, because that came from the heart. And in that episode, there's a number of phrases which I have learned over the years that when I hear that phrase, my internal alarm goes off. And I wonder, just the way you've said this, is maybe there's another episode, which is phrases we use with ourselves that should make us say, wait, what did I just say? So we can go back and reevaluate. I agree with everything you said. And just for some people, you will say feminism or gender equality is not particularly interesting to me. There are other things I'm more interested in. If nothing else, take this episode as how do you create enormous change, and how do you do that in a successful way over a period of time? So this is both an influencers episode, but it is also a change management and a change agent conversation as well.
Sure.
On that note, I know we went a little bit longer than we'd said, but I think we got drawn off at the beginning talking a little bit about politics. Thank you for joining us again this week. We hope you've enjoyed this particular episode of Battling with Business around our influencers. We do one of these every month pretty religiously now, I think. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe. And then every Thursday, a new episode of Battling with Business, whether an influencers episode or one of our standard ones, will fall into your podcast inbox and you'll be able to listen to it. Likewise, if you have enjoyed this episode, there are many other influencers and there are many other episodes that talk about all sorts of aspects of leadership and management. Please do go have a look and check them out. If you did like this as well and you're new to this podcast, if there's one thing you can do for us, it's write a check. No, we don't say write a check. If there's one thing you can do for us, is go and have a conversation with someone about one or more elements of this topic. The reason we are doing this podcast is because even if no one listened, and sometimes we wonder, we love having these conversations. And I know that Gareth, looking across at him as we were doing today, was like, I didn't know that. Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, yeah, that's right. The gift you could give us is if you go and have this conversation with someone else. Go find people in your organization who are also interested in being better or interested in being curious or learning more. Please go share it with them. And if they like this, well, you could tell them about the podcast as well, and they can go listen to it and see if they like it as well. We're available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We're available on battlingwithbiz with a Z on both Twitter and Blue Sky, and we're getting much better at posting the latest updates on there as well. Please do let us know if there's something that you violently disagree with, if we got wrong or we missed, or there is something that you lie awake at night worrying about or thinking about, and you think it would be interesting for us to wrestle with as well. Please do let us know. We both love having guests, feedback from people who are listening. But I think for the moment, that's probably it for us for now. Thank you for joining us with Battling with Business.
The only thing I would say is, if you do have comments, then put them as comments on the platform that you listen to, or email us directly, because engagement is the only way that we're going to see that. So if you have a conversation with somebody or you violently disagree with something we've said, or there's a large chunk of information that we were unaware of that we've missed, then put it in as comments, send us an email, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. See you next week on Battling with Business.
Cheerio.